The priest spoke Latin during my confession, and I realized he wasn't actually forgiving my sins. I knelt in the confessional booth at St. Augustine's Cathedral on a rainy Wednesday evening, my knees pressing into the worn leather cushion that smelled faintly of incense and old wood. The latticed screen between me and Father Dominic cast shadows across my hands as I clasped them together, trying to find the right words to begin. I'd been coming to this church since I was 7 years old, sitting through countless masses with my grandmother, who insisted that faith was the only thing that mattered in this world. She'd passed away 6 months ago, leaving me her entire estate with one strange condition in her will that I visit this specific church every month and make confession to Father Dominic personally. The lawyer had emphasized this wasn't just a suggestion, but a legal requirement to maintain the inheritance, which seemed odd, but I'd attributed it to my grandmother's intense religiosity. Father Dominic cleared his throat on the other side of the screen, and I could see his silhouette shift slightly as he settled into position. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd heard every possible sin a human could commit. I'd never actually spoken to him before tonight, despite attending this church for over 20 years, as he typically handled the evening confessions while I'd always attended morning masses. My voice came out quieter than I intended when I finally spoke, beginning with the traditional opening that my grandmother had drilled into me as a child. I told him it had been 6 months since my last confession, which was technically true, and began listing the usual minor transgressions that most people confess to when they didn't want to reveal anything truly personal. I mentioned being impatient with a coworker, judging someone harshly, lying about being sick to skip a social event I didn't want to attend. Standard stuff that wouldn't raise any eyebrows or require lengthy penance. Father Dominic listened in silence, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing through the screen. When I finished my list and fell silent, waiting for him to begin the absolution prayer, something unexpected happened. He started speaking in Latin, which wasn't unusual for Catholic rituals, but the cadence was wrong somehow. I'd studied Latin extensively in college as part of my linguistics degree, spending 4 years translating ancient texts and religious documents. It was a skill I rarely mentioned because most people found it either pretentious or irrelevant to modern life, but it meant I could understand every word Father Dominic was saying, and what he was saying made my blood run cold. Instead of the traditional absolution prayer that begins with Deus, Pater Misericordiarum, he was reciting something else entirely. The words were Latin, but they weren't prayers of forgiveness. He was speaking about recording and documentation, about adding my confession to some kind of archive, about how I'd fulfilled the first requirement, but there were more to come. His tone was businesslike, almost bureaucratic, as he continued in Latin that he clearly believed I couldn't understand. He mentioned my grandmother by name, calling her the benefactor, and said something about the terms of her agreement being binding across generations. Then he said something that made my stomach drop completely, that my confession today had been captured on the hidden recording device in this booth and would be stored with the others for future use if necessary. I stayed completely still, my hands frozen in their clasped position, trying to process what I was hearing while keeping my face neutral. Father Dominic continued speaking in Latin, describing how the inheritance I'd received was contingent not just on monthly confessions, but on something he called the collection of vulnerabilities. He said the recordings would be kept in the cathedral's vault, along with confessions from dozens of other families who'd made similar arrangements over the decades. My mind was racing through implications while Father Dominic's Latin monologue continued, explaining that the church used these recordings as insurance against certain families ever speaking about church business or withdrawing their financial support. It was blackmail, plain and simple, disguised as religious practice and protected by the sanctity of confession. When he finally finished his Latin explanation, he switched back to English and delivered the standard absolution prayer as if nothing unusual had happened. His voice took on that familiar priestly tone, blessing me and instructing me to say 3 Hail Marys as penance for my sins. I responded with the traditional Amen automatically, my mouth moving while my brain tried to figure out what to do with this information. I left the confessional booth on shaky legs and walked to the front pew where I was supposed to complete my penance prayers, but instead I sat there staring at the altar and trying to make sense of everything. The cathedral was nearly empty at this hour, just an elderly woman lighting candles near the side chapel and a janitor sweeping the far aisle. The stained glass windows cast colored light across the marble floors, creating patterns that had comforted me as a child, but now felt ominous and threatening. My grandmother's inheritance had seemed like a blessing when I'd received it, enough money to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a small house. The monthly confession requirement had seemed like an eccentric but harmless condition, the kind of thing a devoutly religious woman would insist on to ensure her granddaughter stayed connected to the faith. But now I understood it was something much darker, a way to ensure I could never speak freely about whatever secrets my family was supposedly keeping. The problem was, I didn't know what secrets she meant. My family had always seemed boringly normal. My grandmother a retired librarian and my grandfather a postal worker who died when I was 12. There were no scandals I knew about, no dark family history that would require this level of insurance against exposure. Unless there was something I'd never been told, something my grandmother had taken to her grave along with instructions to keep me under surveillance through mandatory confessions. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app, typing quickly while the memories were fresh. I documented every word of Latin that Father Dominic had spoken, translating each phrase into English so I'd have a record. The more I wrote, the angrier I became at the violation of what was supposed to be a sacred and private sacrament. These weren't just my confessions being recorded, but potentially hundreds of other people who came to this cathedral, believing their sins would remain between them and God. I needed to find out more about this arrangement, but I couldn't let Father Dominic know I understood Latin, or he'd realize I'd caught on to the scheme. I stood up from the pew and walked slowly toward the cathedral office, which was located down a side hallway past the sacristy. The door was partially open, and I could see a young administrative assistant named Rebecca sitting at a desk, typing on an old desktop computer. I'd met her briefly a few weeks ago when I'd come to arrange a mass in my grandmother's memory. She looked up as I approached and smiled pleasantly, asking if I needed help with anything. I told her I was curious about the church's archives, that I was doing some family history research and wondered if there were any records about my grandmother's involvement with the cathedral over the years. Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded, and she said most of the old records were kept in storage and weren't available for public viewing. I pressed gently, mentioning that my grandmother had left a generous donation to the church, and I just wanted to understand more about her connection to this place. Rebecca glanced toward a closed door at the back of the office, then back to me, clearly weighing whether to share something. She lowered her voice and said, if I really wanted to know about the old arrangements, I should talk to Monsignor Laurent, who handled the cathedral's financial matters and legacy donations. She wrote down a phone number on a sticky note and handed it to me, suggesting I call for an appointment rather than just showing up. The way she said old arrangements made it clear she knew something about the confession recordings, even if she wasn't directly involved. I thanked her and left the cathedral, stepping out into the rainy evening and walking quickly to my car parked 2 blocks away. The drive home took 20 minutes through heavy traffic, and I spent the entire time mentally replaying Father Dominic's Latin monologue and trying to figure out my next move. If I confronted him directly, he'd know I understood Latin and might destroy whatever evidence existed or deny everything. If I went to the police, they'd likely tell me that recording confessions wasn't technically illegal if I'd consented to being in the confessional, even though I obviously hadn't consented to being recorded. The church could claim it was internal documentation for their own purposes, and I'd signed paperwork when accepting the inheritance that might have included buried clauses about surveillance. I needed more information before deciding how to proceed, needed to understand what my grandmother had really agreed to and why. My apartment felt too quiet when I got home, the silence pressing in on me as I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I started searching for information about St. Augustine's Cathedral, looking for any news articles or public records that might hint at scandals or unusual practices. Most of what I found was standard church history, information about architectural renovations and community outreach programs, and the usual announcements about mass schedules and holy days. But then I found an old newspaper article from 15 years ago, buried deep in the search results, about a lawsuit that had been filed against the cathedral by a former parishioner named Gregory Whitmore. The article was brief and vague, mentioning allegations of privacy violations and misuse of privileged information, but the case had apparently been settled out of court with all parties agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement. I wrote down Gregory Whitmore's name and started searching for any current information about him, eventually finding a LinkedIn profile that showed he was now living in Arizona and working as an accountant. His profile didn't mention anything about the cathedral or the lawsuit, but it listed his email address as publicly visible. I drafted a careful message explaining that I was researching St. Augustine's Cathedral and had come across the old lawsuit, and wondered if he'd be willing to speak with me about his experience there. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, knowing it was a long shot, but hoping he might be willing to break his silence after so many years. The next morning, I called the number Rebecca had given me for Monsignor Laurent, and a polite secretary scheduled me for an appointment the following Monday at 10 in the morning. She asked what the meeting was regarding, and I kept it vague, saying I had questions about my grandmother's legacy donation and the terms of her arrangement with the church. The secretary's tone changed slightly when I mentioned my grandmother's name, becoming more formal, and she confirmed the appointment time before ending the call abruptly. That gave me several days to do more research and hopefully hear back from Gregory Whitmore before walking into what might be a confrontational conversation with church leadership. I spent the weekend going through my grandmother's belongings that I'd inherited along with her house, searching for anything that might explain her arrangement with the cathedral. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from an elderly woman who'd lived alone for the last decade of her life: photo albums and knitting supplies and books about gardening and faith. But in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, hidden under layers of old sweaters, I found a locked metal box about the size of a shoebox. I'd seen it before when sorting through her things after the funeral, but the lawyer had told me it contained just some old jewelry and I should hold on to it for sentimental reasons. Now I wondered if there was more to it than that. The lock was simple and old-fashioned, the kind you could pick with a hairpin if you knew what you were doing. I didn't know what I was doing, but I spent an hour watching YouTube tutorials until I managed to pop it open. Inside was a stack of letters tied with string, all addressed to my grandmother from someone named Augustus Laurent. I recognized the last name immediately as matching the Monsignor I was scheduled to meet with on Monday. The letters dated back over 40 years, starting when my grandmother was in her early 30s. I untied the string with trembling hands and began reading the first letter, which was written in formal but warm language, thanking my grandmother for her continued discretion, and assuring her that the arrangement benefits everyone involved. The second letter was more specific, mentioning a payment schedule and referring to something called the Repository of Assurances. By the third letter, the tone had shifted to something almost threatening, reminding my grandmother that her family's reputation depended on maintaining silence about the incident of 1979, and that the church's protection was contingent on her cooperation. I read through all 17 letters, and by the end I had a clearer but more disturbing picture of what had happened. In 1979, my grandmother had apparently witnessed something at the cathedral involving financial impropriety and possibly abuse, though the letters never specified exactly what. Instead of reporting it to authorities, she'd been convinced to sign an agreement with the church where they would provide her with regular payments in exchange for her silence. The payments had continued for decades, eventually being formalized into the inheritance arrangement that now bound me to monthly recorded confessions. It was generational blackmail, ensuring that even after my grandmother's death, the church maintained leverage over her descendants. The letters referenced the repository, which I now understood was the vault of recorded confessions Father Dominic had mentioned in Latin. Each letter from Augustus Laurent included reminders that breaking the agreement would result in the release of documented evidence that would prove damaging to your family's standing in the community. I felt sick reading this, understanding that my grandmother had been trapped in a coercive relationship with the church for most of her adult life. On Sunday evening, I received an email response from Gregory Whitmore in Arizona. His message was cautious but intrigued, saying he'd be willing to talk if I could prove I wasn't working for the cathedral or the archdiocese. He suggested we have a video call, and I agreed immediately, setting up a time for later that night. When his face appeared on my laptop screen at 9 o'clock, he looked tired and suspicious, his eyes scanning the background of my apartment as if checking for listening devices. I showed him my driver's license to prove my identity, then explained everything that had happened in the confessional booth, my understanding of Latin, the letters I'd found from Monsignor Laurent to my grandmother. Gregory's expression shifted from suspicion to grim recognition as I spoke, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said he'd been waiting 15 years for someone else to figure out what was happening at St. Augustine's. His story was similar to mine in the fundamentals but different in the details. His father had been a major donor to the cathedral in the 1990s, and as part of that relationship, the family had been required to make regular confessions that were recorded without their knowledge. When Gregory discovered the recordings by accident, finding a backup device that had been carelessly left in an unlocked office, he'd confronted Monsignor Laurent and demanded the recordings be destroyed. Instead, the church had threatened to release edited versions of the confessions to make it appear that Gregory's father had confessed to financial crimes he'd never actually committed. They'd created false audio by splicing together different confession sessions, taking words out of context to build incriminating statements that sounded authentic. Gregory had filed a lawsuit, but the church's lawyers had buried him in motions and delays until he'd run out of money and emotional energy to continue fighting. The settlement had required him to sign an NDA and leave the state, which is why he'd ended up in Arizona. He'd spent the last 15 years trying to rebuild his life while knowing that other families were probably still being victimized by the same scheme. I asked him if he'd kept any evidence from his lawsuit, and his expression became guarded again before he nodded slowly and said he'd kept copies of everything despite the NDA requiring him to destroy all documentation. He said if I was serious about exposing this, he'd be willing to share those files with me, but I needed to understand the risk I was taking. The church had powerful attorneys and deep pockets, and they'd use every legal tool available to protect the repository and the arrangement. I told him I was serious, that I couldn't just accept my grandmother's inheritance knowing it was blood money paid to ensure her silence about crimes and abuses. Gregory sent me an encrypted file that night containing hundreds of pages of legal documents, recorded confessions, and internal church memos about the repository system. I spent hours reading through everything, and the scope of what I discovered was staggering. The confession recording scheme wasn't limited to St. Augustine's Cathedral, but extended to at least 6 other churches in the archdiocese. Thousands of confessions had been recorded over decades, creating a massive archive of potentially embarrassing or incriminating information about prominent families, business leaders, and politicians. The church used this repository as leverage to maintain donations, suppress scandals, and ensure favorable treatment in legal and political matters. Some of the recorded confessions had been edited and weaponized exactly as Gregory described, creating false evidence that could be used to blackmail people into compliance. The memos showed that Monsignor Laurent had been running this operation for over 30 years, with the full knowledge and approval of at least 3 different bishops who'd served in the archdiocese during that time. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading through all the files, understanding that this wasn't just a local corruption, but a systemic abuse that had touched hundreds of lives. Monday morning arrived too quickly, and I dressed carefully for my meeting with Monsignor Laurent, choosing professional clothes that would make me look serious but not confrontational. I brought my laptop with all of Gregory's files loaded onto an encrypted drive, along with the letters I'd found in my grandmother's belongings. The cathedral office felt different now that I understood what was really happening there. The beautiful architecture and religious artwork feeling more like set decoration for a criminal enterprise than genuine expressions of faith. Monsignor Laurent's office was on the 3rd floor, accessed through a private elevator that required a keycard. His secretary, a different woman than the one I'd spoken to on the phone, escorted me down a long hallway lined with portraits of previous church leaders. The Monsignor himself was in his 70s, tall and imposing with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed me carefully as I entered his office. He gestured to a chair across from his massive desk and settled into his own seat with the confident air of someone who'd handled thousands of uncomfortable conversations. He began by offering condolences about my grandmother's passing, saying she'd been a valued member of the church community, and her legacy donation had been instrumental in funding various charitable works. I let him talk for a few minutes, watching his body language and listening for any hints about what he really knew. When he finally asked how he could help me with questions about the inheritance arrangement, I decided to be direct rather than playing games. I told him I knew about the repository, about the recorded confessions, about the blackmail scheme that had been running for decades. His face remained completely neutral as I spoke, not showing surprise or guilt or anger, just a kind of cold calculation as he assessed how much I actually knew. When I finished my summary and pulled out the letters from my grandmother's dresser, placing them on his desk, his expression finally shifted to something resembling concern. He picked up the letters and glanced through them quickly, then set them down and folded his hands together. His voice was calm when he spoke, explaining that I seemed to have some misunderstandings about the church's document retention policies and the nature of legacy arrangements. He claimed the letters were simply confirmation of standard donation agreements and that any reference to recorded confessions was being taken out of context. I opened my laptop and turned it toward him, showing him one of the internal memos from Gregory's files that explicitly described the repository system and its use as leverage against prominent families. Monsignor Laurent's face hardened as he read the screen, and I could see him processing the implications of me having access to these documents. He asked where I'd obtained this information, and I told him about Gregory Whitmore and the lawsuit that had been settled 15 years ago. The Monsignor's jaw tightened slightly, the first real crack in his composed exterior, and he said that case had involved a disturbed individual making false allegations. I interrupted him and played one of the audio files from Gregory's evidence, a recording of Father Dominic speaking in Latin about the repository during a confession, followed by the edited version where the same person's words had been spliced together to create a false admission of embezzlement. The office fell completely silent as the audio played, and when it ended, Monsignor Laurent stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the cathedral grounds. His voice was different when he spoke again, losing the professional polish and becoming harder, more threatening. He said I was making serious accusations about a respected religious institution based on stolen documents, and the word of a man who'd signed an NDA agreeing never to discuss these matters. He suggested I was looking for a larger payout than what my grandmother's inheritance provided, and that if I was trying to extort money from the church, I'd find myself facing both civil and criminal charges. I stayed seated and told him I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the truth about what happened to my grandmother and what was still happening to other families. I wanted the repository destroyed and the recording equipment removed from the confessional booths. I wanted an admission that the church had violated the sacred seal of confession and used private religious communications for blackmail purposes. Monsignor Laurent turned back from the window and said very clearly that none of that would be happening, that I had no evidence that would hold up in court because everything I described was protected by religious privilege and attorney-client confidentiality. He said if I attempted to go public with these allegations, the church's legal team would bury me in defamation suits and I'd lose everything, including my inheritance. Then he added something that made my blood run cold, reminding me that the church had recordings of my own confessions now, and while I hadn't said anything particularly damaging yet, there were many months remaining in the inheritance requirement period. I realized he was threatening to create false evidence against me the same way they'd done to others, editing my future confessions to manufacture incriminating statements if I didn't back down. I closed my laptop and stood up, telling him I was going to leave his office now and think carefully about my next steps. He nodded and said that was wise, that I should consider the consequences for my career and reputation before making any rash decisions. His voice followed me as I walked toward the door, reminding me that my next required confession was in 3 weeks, and he expected to see me there if I wanted to maintain the inheritance. I left the cathedral and sat in my car for a long time, trying to stop my hands from shaking. The conversation had confirmed everything I'd suspected, but also made clear how difficult it would be to fight back against an institution with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. I couldn't go to the police with stolen evidence obtained through an NDA violation. And even if I did, the church would claim religious privilege and tie up any investigation in legal challenges for years. I needed a different approach, something that would expose the truth while protecting me from retaliation. I spent the next week reaching out to other people mentioned in Gregory's files, families who'd been trapped in similar arrangements with St. Augustine's and the other churches in the archdiocese. Most of them refused to speak with me, too afraid of the consequences or too invested in maintaining their own silence, but 3 people agreed to confidential conversations where they shared their own experiences with the repository system. Each story followed a similar pattern to my grandmother's: an initial witness to some kind of misconduct or abuse, followed by a financial arrangement that evolved into mandatory confessions and recorded surveillance, all backed by threats of releasing edited or authentic embarrassing information if they spoke out. One woman named Juliette Brennan had been trapped in this system for over 20 years after witnessing financial fraud in the cathedral's construction fund. Another man, Thomas Blackwell, had discovered the confession recording equipment by accident while serving as a volunteer coordinator, and had been immediately brought into a coercive agreement to keep silent. All of them wanted the system exposed, but were terrified of the personal cost of coming forward publicly. I contacted a journalist friend from college named Isabel Chen, who worked for a major investigative news outlet in the city. I knew she specialized in stories about institutional abuse and corruption, and I thought she might be interested in this case. We met at a coffee shop far from the cathedral, and I walked her through everything I'd discovered, showing her the letters, the legal documents from Gregory's lawsuit, and the audio recordings of Father Dominic speaking in Latin about the repository. Isabel's eyes got wider as I explained the scope of the scheme, and she immediately started taking notes and asking detailed questions about sources and documentation. She said this was exactly the kind of story her outlet would want to investigate, but she'd need multiple on-the-record sources willing to confirm the allegations. Anonymous sources wouldn't be enough for a story this explosive about a powerful religious institution. I told her about Gregory in Arizona and the 3 other people I'd spoken with locally, but explained that most of them were bound by NDAS, or too frightened to go public. Isabel said she could work with that if at least 2 people were willing to go on record, and that her outlet's legal team could help protect sources from retaliation. She'd also need to verify the authenticity of the audio recordings and internal memos, which would require analysis by forensic experts. She estimated it would take at least 6 weeks to fully investigate and prepare the story, and during that time I should continue appearing to comply with the cathedral's requirements so they wouldn't suspect anything. The hardest part was going back to St. Augustine's 3 weeks later for my next mandatory confession, knowing that Father Dominic would be recording every word I said, and potentially editing it later for use against me. I prepared carefully, deciding to confess only the most mundane and harmless things possible, avoiding any statements that could be taken out of context or manipulated. When I entered the confessional booth, my heart was racing so fast I thought Father Dominic might hear it through the screen. I went through the standard opening prayers and began my carefully scripted confession about minor impatience and occasional unkind thoughts, speaking clearly and precisely so there would be no ambiguity in my words. Father Dominic listened in silence as usual, and when I finished, he began speaking in Latin again, apparently still confident that I couldn't understand him. This time, his Latin commentary was more detailed and more disturbing, mentioning that Monsignor Laurent had flagged my file as requiring special attention, and that my confessions should be analyzed carefully for any signs of rebellion or investigation. He said something about increasing surveillance and possibly requiring more frequent confessions if I showed any indication of becoming a problem like the Whitmore family had been. Then he switched back to English and delivered the standard absolution prayer, his voice taking on that familiar priestly tone that now made my skin crawl. I completed my penance prayers in the front pew, but this time I noticed small details I'd missed before, like the tiny camera lens barely visible in the carved woodwork near the altar, and another one disguised in a light fixture above the side chapel. The entire cathedral was under surveillance, not just the confessional booths, which meant everyone who came here for worship or counseling or any reason was being recorded without their knowledge or consent. I documented everything I could see and sent the information to Isabel that evening, adding to the growing evidence file she was building. Over the next month, Isabel's investigation moved forward while I continued my routine of monthly confessions and apparent compliance with the cathedral's requirements. She'd convinced Gregory Whitmore to go on record despite his NDA, arguing that the agreement was void if it was used to cover up ongoing criminal activity. She'd also gotten Juliette Brennan to agree to speak publicly about her experience, though Thomas Blackwell remained too frightened to come forward with his name attached. The forensic analysis of the audio recordings confirmed they were authentic, and also revealed evidence of the editing techniques used to create false confessions from spliced-together audio fragments. Isabel's outlet assigned a team of 3 journalists to help with the investigation, and they uncovered even more evidence of the repository system extending beyond what Gregory's files had shown. They found financial records showing the Archdiocese had paid out millions in settlements to keep various scandals quiet over the decades, all funded by the mandatory donations from families trapped in the repository arrangements. The story was scheduled to publish on a Thursday morning in late autumn, and Isabel called me the night before to confirm I was prepared for the fallout. She explained that the church would likely sue everyone involved, that my inheritance might be revoked, and that I'd probably need to hire my own attorney to defend against retaliation. I told her I understood the risks and was ready to face them, that exposing this system was more important than protecting my own comfort or financial security. The article went live at 6 a.m. with a headline that read, Archdiocese's Secret Repository, Decades of Recorded Confessions Used for Blackmail and Control. It was accompanied by audio recordings, scanned documents, and interviews with multiple sources including Gregory, Juliette, and myself. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with the story being shared thousands of times within the first hour and major news outlets picking it up for their own coverage. By noon, the Archdiocese had released a statement denying all allegations and announcing they were filing lawsuits against the news outlet and everyone who'd participated in the story. Monsignor Laurent appeared on local television that evening, looking composed and dignified as he dismissed the accusations as a coordinated attack by disgruntled former parishioners seeking financial gain. He claimed the repository was simply an archive of donation records, and the audio recordings were either fabricated or taken completely out of context. But his denials became harder to maintain as more people came forward over the following days, emboldened by seeing others speak publicly about their experiences. Within a week, over 30 families had contacted Isabel's outlet with similar stories about the confession recording scheme and coercive arrangements. The state attorney general announced an investigation into the Archdiocese's practices, and federal prosecutors began looking into potential wire fraud and racketeering charges. The Vatican sent representatives to review the situation, and several bishops who'd been aware of the repository system were quietly removed from their positions. Father Dominic was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and Monsignor Laurent resigned citing health reasons, though everyone understood he was being forced out. The lawsuits against us moved forward, but lost momentum as public opinion turned decisively against the church, and more evidence emerged. My inheritance was indeed revoked, but I found I didn't care as much as I'd expected. The money had been tainted from the beginning, paid to ensure my grandmother's silence about abuses she'd witnessed. 6 months after the story published, I attended a press conference where the Archdiocese formally apologized for the repository system and announced they were destroying all recorded confessions and removing surveillance equipment from their churches. They established a compensation fund for victims and implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. It felt like a victory, though an incomplete one since so much damage had already been done to so many people over so many years. I started attending a different church across town, one with no connection to St. Augustine's or the Archdiocese, trying to rebuild my relationship with faith after everything that had happened. It was difficult separating the institutional corruption from the spiritual practice that had meant so much to my grandmother, despite her being trapped in an abusive arrangement. I met with a therapist who specialized in religious trauma, and slowly began to understand that faith and the institutions claiming to represent it were not the same thing. Gregory Whitmore flew in from Arizona for the press conference, and we met in person for the first time, 2 people who'd been damaged by the same system and had fought back in different ways at different times. We stayed in touch after that, forming an unexpected friendship based on shared experience and mutual understanding of what it meant to challenge powerful institutions. He told me that speaking publicly about his experience after 15 years of enforced silence had been terrifying but ultimately healing, that carrying the secret alone had been eating away at him for too long. The last time I visited St. Augustine's Cathedral was almost a year after the story broke, when they held a memorial service for victims of the repository system who'd died before seeing justice. My grandmother's name was read along with dozens of others, people who'd been trapped in coercive arrangements and had carried that burden to their graves. I lit a candle for her in the side chapel where I'd sat as a child, thinking about all the Sunday mornings we'd spent here together when I'd had no idea what she was enduring. The cathedral felt different now, quieter somehow, with far fewer people attending services than before the scandal broke. The beautiful stained glass and marble floors were still there, but the sense of sanctuary had been shattered by the revelation of what had been happening behind the scenes. As I left through the main doors, I paused to look back at the building one final time, thinking about how a confession booth could be transformed from a place of forgiveness into a tool of surveillance and control. I thought about Father Dominic speaking Latin and assuming no one would understand, about Monsignor Laurent threatening to manufacture evidence against me, about my grandmother signing letters agreeing to silence herself for decades. And I thought about the power of language, how understanding something you're not supposed to understand can change everything. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.